The only tooth?
The air behind the Grand Ole Opry curtain always seemed thick with more than steam from stage lights. It pulsed with ghostly wisps of tobacco swirling around legends whose songs etched the soundtrack of a nation. Long before the first amplifier hummed, a ragged cough from Johnny Cash echoed in the wings, reminding everyone how the man in black often sounded more like gravel than velvet. Cash once joked that God sandpapered his larynx to give him character, but the reality was simpler and far darker. Every growl was a bill coming due, a raspy receipt listing the price his lungs were paying for that cracked-open honesty. Waylon Jennings watched from a battered folding chair, a cigarette perched on calloused fingers that once held a bass for Buddy Holly. 6 packs a day had become Jennings's compulsory ritual, each tiny ember matching the outlaw fire in his gut. He told wide-eyed newcomers he needed the smoke to keep tremor out of his lyrics, though friends knew nicotine's leash was pulling him toward heart failure and the amputation that followed. On his last tour, he leaned against amp stacks between numbers, panting while the crowd screamed for more rebellion, unaware the true rebellion would have been choosing oxygen over mythology. Across the hall, Willie Nelson plucked an acoustic 6-string between stretches of controlled yoga breaths. Doctors had warned that lungs scarred by cigarettes might end his marathon sets, so Willie tossed the tobacco and kept the lighter, now igniting gentle clouds of cannabis instead. He chuckles that he just changed crops, but the pivot saved his weathered tenor. Gone are nights of hacking fits. In their place stands an octogenarian who can still bend a note until it curls around the rafters like morning mist on an Austin hillside. Merle Haggard once claimed he could judge a honky-tonk by its ceiling stains. The darker the nicotine tar, the realer the stories spilling across the bar. That romantic metric haunted him when surgeons removed a portion of his lung, leaving him short of breath and heavy with remorse. His final shows bore a tender vulnerability, every shortened phrase carrying an invisible footnote that chasing smoke while chasing dreams can leave a man breathless in more ways than one. George Jones learned that truth inside an oxygen tent. For years, he masked breathlessness with jokes about having no voice left to waste anyway. When chronic obstructive pulmonary disease clamped down, each refrain of "he stopped loving her today" sounded painfully literal. Nurses later described watching Jones struggle to finish a line, determined to deliver perfection even as his blood begged for air. Fans applauded the grit. His doctors quietly increased the flow rate. Conway Twitty collapsed on a Memphis stage, microphone tumbling from fingers that had guided countless slow dance classics. Headlines blamed exhaustion, but bandmates whispered that decades of habitual puffing had tightened his arteries until moderate strain became fatal territory. Though he returned to perform, friends noticed the baritone wavering whenever fog machines hissed, a cruel reminder that theatrical mist looked too much like the real thing that haunted his lungs. Hank Williams Sr. never met a sleepless night he couldn't quiet with pills, whiskey, and endless cigarettes. The whirlwind that produced "I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry" also shredded his heart before he reached 30. His driver found him cold in the back seat on New Year's Day. A crushed cigarette smoldered beneath boot leather, embers fading like the chance for redemption. 2 decades earlier, Buddy Holly and Richie Valens huddled in a frigid Iowa ballroom, lungs filled with nervous smoke while debating whether to fly or freeze on the tour bus. Holly, still mourning every wheeze he heard from Jennings, said the plane would buy a warm night's rest. Valens, a teenager desperate to seem older, borrowed a cigarette to steady his hands before flipping a now-famous coin for the spare seat. The world knows how that gamble ended. The February sky swallowed their tune-filled futures and left only ashes drifting across cornfields. Chris Christopherson stands at the edge of these cautionary tales like a living footnote. He bulldozed through years of chain smoking and binging until a startling epiphany, some recall a mirror, others a stern physician, pushed him toward sobriety. He crushed his last cigarette decades ago, trading hazy mornings for mountain hikes and songwriting sessions that still stretch well into his 80s. The gravel timbre remains, now carved by experience instead of toxins. Hank Williams Jr. inherited more than a legendary name. Restless lungs trudged through Marlboro miles just as fiercely as his father's did. Even after publicly quitting, backstage whispers say he sneaks the occasional drag, perhaps haunted by the specter of a man he barely knew. When he belts "A Country Boy Can Survive," there's an unspoken addendum: only if the country boy remembers to breathe. Buck Owens never left Bakersfield without a carton stuffed in his guitar case. "Keeps the strings from rusting," he'd laugh. Years later, lying in a hospital bed after a minor heart attack, he joked that he should have cared more about the strings inside his chest. Doctors demanded immediate cessation. Owens struggled, but eventually substituted cigarettes with sugar-free mints, savoring each candy like an encore. Glenn Campbell's rhinestone smile disguised wars far messier than primetime specials suggested. At his fame's pinnacle, he wrestled with coke, tobacco, and bottle-shaped demons simultaneously. Quitting cigarettes in 1992 became a fresh gospel, and he credited clearer lungs for sharpening his tenor during his final farewell tour. Behind closed doors, Campbell admitted that casting out one vice softened the blow of facing the others. Marty Robbins split life between stage and speedway, lighting cigarettes to settle adrenaline before diving 180 miles per hour into Phoenix corners. His lungs paid. After multiple open-heart surgeries, he still insisted on racing, telling friends he'd rather die shifting gears than gasping in a recliner. The irony rang loud. A man obsessed with horsepower couldn't outrun the smoke curling in his chest. Lefty Frizzell mesmerized crowds with phrasing that dripped like molasses, but nicotine slowly thickened that syrup until each word weighed him down. A stroke at 47 froze half his grin, making every show a gamble on muscle memory. He blamed cigars puffed while writing hits, darkly joking about smoking my way into the charts. In the end, the charts outlived him. Ernest Tubb greeted fans with thanks a lot, even when oxygen tanks awaited backstage. He wheeled those tanks like silent bandmates, refusing to cancel tours because he believed country music was a service, not a luxury. Stagehands recall him stepping forward into follow spots, disconnecting the hose for 3.5 minutes of song, then reconnecting as lights dimmed. The crowd never saw him gasp, they only felt gratitude. Charlie Rich spent nights filling intimate clubs with thick piano chords and thicker smoke, the glowing tip of his Pall Mall tracing lazy arcs over ivory. His nickname, the Silver Fox, referenced early gray hair his pals insisted came more from nicotine than age. On a humid July drive through Mississippi, a fatal clot stopped him mid-journey. Doctors later noted that constant smoking increases clot risk. Rich's final encore proved the data. Alan Jackson rarely meets a reporter without praising small-town values, yet he avoids discussing the bus-only habit crew members whisper about. Insiders claim private puffs protect his wholesome image. During recent tours, fans noticed him skipping high harmonies, which he blamed on allergies, while technicians suspected waning lung capacity. Jackson remains cagey, hoping silence might hide what smoke eventually reveals. Keith Whitley's voice sounded as if it had traveled through heartbreak forests before touching microphones, warm, bruised, and intimate. He was no stranger to tobacco, but liquor raced faster, claiming his life by acute alcohol poisoning. Friends preserved the final cigarette crushed in his home ashtray, a mute witness to vices lining up like jealous suitors when a talent burns too brightly. By now, this roll call of coughs and coffins could fill arenas twice over. Yet younger artists still puff beneath stadium bleachers, convinced fame stamps a warranty of invincibility. Statistics paint a colder portrait. Smoking kills more musicians than car wrecks, plane crashes, and pyrotechnic mishaps combined. Science doesn't bend for melody. Tar doesn't care about platinum plaques. But cautionary tales sometimes sprout hope. Willie Nelson's tobacco-free renaissance proves quitting can resurrect a career. Chris Christopherson's elder statesman aura shows clear lungs can carry a songwriter all the way to the far horizon. Even Buck Owens, despite a late conversion, earned extra years to mentor Bakersfield upstarts. The pattern glows like a neon exit sign. Step away from the haze, and the road may stretch longer than any encore. Still, the lure remains. Backstage camaraderie feels as old as the steel guitar itself. Veterans hand out cigarettes like business cards. Rookies accept them like secret membership tokens. Promoters pray alarms don't trigger sprinklers while stagehands fan detectors. Behind every thunderous cheer lurks a cough echoing through stairwells, reminding us applause can't drown physiology. Picture Johnny Cash today walking into studios lined with air purifiers and vape clouds instead of Marlboro Reds. Would he trade his ragged rasp for smoother resonance, or was that grit essential to the myth? Fans romanticize rough edges without absorbing the pain that carves them. Cash sacrificed lung tissue for authenticity, but authenticity never paid for nebulizers. Likewise, Merle Haggard's surgical scars hide beneath denim and legend. He left timeless lines about mama's prayers and prison walls, yet his final verse was sung through dwindling breath. One more outlaw anthem might have emerged if every pre-show ritual hadn't included a lighter flick. The reflection applies to George Jones, whose flawless phrasing at 20 evolved into a heroic duel against his own respiratory system. A dual physiology ultimately won. You might ask why, after losing Holly, Valens, and an army of highwaymen to smoke and circumstance, the industry still glamorizes cigarettes. Part is image control, a crooked grin framed by curling smoke photographs beautifully. Part is stress, endless travel, thin hotel walls, critics measuring careers in chart weeks. Nicotine offers quick comfort while secretly filing eviction notices on every alveolus. That tension, short-term calm versus long-term crisis, sits at the heart of every smoky chorus. Hank Williams Jr. belts survival anthems while flirting with the dangers that silenced his father. Alan Jackson croons about simple living yet hides complicated habits. Each artist gambles minutes of future applause for one fleeting backstage exhale, hoping skill will outrun biology. Fans feed the mythology. They buy vintage posters where Conway Twitty seductively lifts a cigarette, ignoring the oxygen tanks that later flanked his bed. They stream Ernest Tubbs' live tapes without seeing the clear tubing snaking behind amplifiers. In the digital age, filters erase the cough and leave only glamorous embers. Time, however, keeps its own ledger. A newer crop of voices surveys warning signs etched into tombstones and posthumous box sets. Some, like modern chart toppers, sidestep nicotine entirely, choosing herbal teas over smoldering thrones. Their smoke-free lungs serve as quiet footnotes to tonight's narrative, the cost of ignoring caution. Stage lights dim, fans spill into parking lots, and glowing tips puncture darkness behind arenas. It is here that legends decide whether to stub out their future or let it smolder. Willie Nelson reaches for peppermint instead of a lighter. Chris Christopherson sips water. Somewhere in the rafters, a newcomer recalls Buck Owens's old jest about rusty strings and wonders if that carton in his duffel might corrode something more vital. So the next time a vinyl crackles with Lefty Frizzell's wounded poetry, or Marty Robbins guns an imaginary engine behind El Paso, remember every strained inhale that left fingerprints on those notes. When Keith Whitley's haunting tenor slips through headphones, recall that one more cigarette might have robbed us of even that short catalog. When a DJ cues Hank Williams Sr. at midnight, picture the lonely backseat glow of his final smoke. These aren't mere cautionary asides, they are integral verses in the ballad of country music. If the ghosts of country could gather for one last encore, they might trade gold records for fresh breaths. They'd beg Waylon Jennings to surrender rebellion for oxygen, invite George Jones to swap nicotine for longevity, plead with Johnny Cash to choose morning walks over morning coughs, and slip Alan Jackson a discreet note. Lungs keep score even when fans don't. Country lyrics adore crossroads and choices, and tobacco remains the most consequential fork. Some heroes, like Willie and Chris, took the dirt path away from smoke and found extra chapters. Others marched straight into the fog, believing destiny shielded them. Fate listened, puffed once, and wrote a different arrangement. The story ends where it began. Backstage, neon buzzing, strings humming, a lone ember flickering between nervous fingers. The legend about to walk on stage faces a question older than the Opry itself. Is the next inhale worth the next chorus? The spotlight waits. The audience roars. Somewhere a cigarette hisses, and in that thin wisp of smoke hangs the fragile heartbeat of country music history. For decades, tobacco companies treated country stars as walking billboards. Promotional photographs required the singer to cradle a glowing cigarette, and cartons arrived in dressing rooms with handwritten notes from executives thanking the artist for keeping the image alive. When Glenn Campbell finally revealed those contracts, he described entire shoots being rescheduled if the ember looked too small. Fans who framed those glossy pages never guessed their idols had been paid to model slow-motion self-destruction. The warnings were posted in plain sight. Ernest Tubb taped medical clippings about tar buildup on the tour bus fridge, yet he still lit up between sets. Keith Whitley's widow begged him to trade cigarettes for chewing gum. He promised, but studio tension lured him outside where nicotine mingled with Kentucky fog. By the time he stepped back to the microphone, sweetness in his vibrato hid lungs already pleading for mercy. Industry accountants finally panicked when George Jones's hospitalization canceled a summer amphitheater season. Venues lost millions overnight, and math spoke louder than moral lectures. New contracts slipped in non-smoking clauses, festivals built quit tents beside first aid stations, and a sober Chris Christopherson delivered pep talks, reminding rookies that healthy lungs meant longer encores. High-definition recording joined the crusade, exposing every rasp. Producers told Hank Williams Jr. to record in shorter bursts, and Alan Jackson added humidifiers, issuing a vague note about protecting vocal integrity. Yet ember trails still flicker behind arenas. Habits die harder than the stars who sold them, and the next verse of country music will be written in clean air or stubborn smoke. The choice lies in every hand that reaches for a lighter. Yet even as a new generation tunes guitars inside smoke-free studios, the argument refuses to fade. Purists claim the husky drawl pressed onto golden records is pure soul, while physicians counter that it is scar tissue promoted to style. Streaming engineers scrub hiss and needle crackle but leave every rasping inhale intact, tiny warning stickers encrypted in the waveform. Listeners double-tap their screens, replaying a breath from George Jones the way a scientist rewinds a seismic blip before the quake. Tour bus managers now tape neon infographics beside the snack baskets, charting how 24 tobacco-free hours can stretch a falsetto and how a single week can restore an entire half-step. Vocal coaches carry handheld carbon monoxide meters, waving them like airport wands before rehearsals. When readings spike, practice halts and hydration begins. Record labels quietly slip wellness clauses into contracts, swapping the old carton stipend for fitness app credits and bonus royalties awarded only if lungs stay clear. Insurance underwriters smile at spreadsheets that show fewer cancellations, proof that clean breath pays dividends larger than nostalgia ever did. Still, memory clings harder than tar. During hologram tribute nights, shimmering projections of Hank Williams Sr. or Lefty Frizzell glow across jumbotrons, pixelated cigarettes dangling between phantom fingers. Audiences roar, a bittersweet ovation for legends technology can revive but never heal. Backstage, a jittery newcomer pats his pocket for gum, temptation buzzing like an encore button on standby. He recalls statistics, funerals, postponed tours, and doctor-ordered silences, yet mythology still whispers louder than any medical journal could shout. The moment hangs suspended, heavy with history, but habit alone cannot outsing the promise of freshly earned air. He chooses quiet, then inhales venue oxygen, crisp, untainted, alive with possibility tonight. Almost. Resolve steals in his chest. Instead of sparks and haze, he steps beneath the lights, chest open, voice bright, proving the heartbreak can survive without the fog. When the final chord dissolves, he exhales gratitude, walking off stage toward a future unsmudged by smoke and unburdened by ash. Outside, the night air greets him with applause of its own, welcoming a chapter where breath outlasts legend and myth. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and also click the next video shown on your screen.